In Madurai, city of temples and poets, who sang of cities and temples, every summer a river dries to a trickle in the sand, bearing the sand drips, straw, and women's hair, clogging the water gates at the rusty bars, under the bridges with patches of repair all over them, the wet stones glistening like sleepy crocodiles, the dry ones, shaven water buffaloes lounging in the sun. The poets only sang of the floods. Ramanujan's pungent irony is powerfully operative from the very opening sentence of the poem. Madurai, the poet observes, is a city of temples and poets. And the poets here always sing of cities and temples. The obvious ironic suggestion is that the poets are indifferent to the human beings and their sufferings. The poem, after the initial ironic dig, presents a river pictorially during the summer season. The poet graphically describes how in every summer the river is reduced to a narrow stream and how its water cannot pass through the water gates because of the piles of the straw and women's hair that obstruct its flow. As the river is almost empty, the sand drifts on the bed of the river are visible. The stones that lie on the bed of the river are exposed. The portion of the river under the bridge has also been described. There were patches of repair under the bridge and over the rusty bars of the bridge. The wet stones looked like sleepy crocodiles, and the dry ones resembled the shaven water buffaloes. He started blaming the poets of the city who sang only of the floods and ignored human miseries. Ramanujan's satire is here directed to those old and new poets who are only romantically obsessed and inspired by the sight of the flooded river. They are quite indifferent to the innocent victims of the flood. Ramanujan's poem attains the grandeur of stark realism through the presentation of some realistic images associated with the river during the dry summer. His approach in the poem is not only to depict realism, but to enhance and emphasize the inherent humanism that is intimately linked with that realism. He was there for a day when they had the floods. People everywhere talked of the inches rising, of the precise number of cobbled steps run over by the water, rising on the bathing places, and the way it carried off 3 village houses, 1 pregnant woman, and a couple of cows named Gopi and Brinda as usual. In this part of the poem, the picture of the river during the rainy season is drawn. Ramanujan's ironic hit reaches its height when he introduces a third person observer who has visited the village during a flood. He records the response of the people to the flood. The people talked about the number of inches the water had risen by, the number of steps submerged by the water, and the number of houses carried away by the flood. They also chatted how the flooded river washed away 1 pregnant woman and a couple of cows named Gobi and Brinda. The phrase, as usual, is tinged with irony. The callous attitude of the people to look at the flood has been sharply criticized. The image of the pregnant woman is significant, for it involves two generations, the present and the future. The new poets still quoted the old poets, but no one spoke in verse of the pregnant woman drowned, with perhaps twins in her, kicking at blank walls even before death, before birth. In this stanza, the poet attacks heavily on the new poets who blindly followed the old poets, glorifying the river and the flood. Ramanujan's satirical dig here is the sterility of the new Tamil poets who still quoted the old poets. Such poets imitate the matter and the manner of the old poets, and the futile stereotype of poetry continues. Such poets lack not only the realism that the true poets aspire to, but also the creative invention. Both the old and the new poets did not open their eyes towards human problems. They were not much or alive to or sympathetic with human sufferings. They did not write about the woman who was carrying twins. Before their birth, she was drowned in the flooded river. At the time of drowning, most probably, the twins must have kicked the side of her womb. She must have got much pain out of this. But both the new poets and the old poets did not refer to all these miseries of the woman in their poetic creations. They are totally callous and indifferent. This kind of attitude makes their poetry weak, unappealing, dry, and cheerless. He said, "The river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year, and then it carries away in the first half hour the three village houses, a couple of cows named Gobi and Brinda, and one pregnant woman expecting identical twins with no moles on their bodies, with different colored diapers to tell them apart." The last stanza sums up the earlier stanzas. In order to restate the loss, the poet repeats a few lines of the preceding passage. The focus of Ramanujan is on the human element, the tragic loss of human life and potential, iconized by the pregnant woman presumably carrying two identical twins drowned in the flood. But there is a touch of irony when Ramanujan refers to the visitor's regret. The river has water enough to be poetic about only once a year. The man perhaps would be happier if the river flooded its banks frequently. Such indifference and inhumanity is undesirable and unacceptable to the genre of poetry and to the mankind. The image of the lady is condensed one. From the exterior, only one life is lost. In reality, however, there are three. The lives inside her do exist, but they are devoid of identity, defined by the lack of moles, and their explanation in terms of statistics. In contrast are the attribution of proper nouns to the cows, Brinda and Gopi. What Ramanujan implies is that poets only idealize or commercialize the situation, and nothing is done practically to prevent or reduce the damage done by the devastation. Thank you.